I'm Darrell Owens, Director of Communications for Beacon College and today's Master of Ceremonies and moderator. Welcome to the Beacon College Symposium on Learning Disabilities. You'll hear from me more later on today, but right now I want to introduce Dr. Daniel Averbach, a licensed psychologist specializing in industrial and organizational psychology, and president and owner of Applied Assessments Incorporated, a firm which implements principles of applied psychology and organizational behavior to advance both corporate change and individual development. Dr. Averbach also serves as chairman of the board of trustees at Beacon College. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Daniel Averbach.
Well, good morning, everyone. Wow, we'll have a greater response later, I hope. On behalf of the Board of Trustees, the administration, the faculty, the staff of Beacon College, it's really my pleasure to welcome you today to this National Symposium on Learning Disabilities. We are honored to host this important assembly in conjunction with the celebration of the 30th anniversary of the founding of Beacon College, the first fully accredited institution of higher education to offer bachelor's degrees specifically to individuals who learn differently. Now, since its founding, Beacon has been at the forefront of designing and implementing innovative teaching and support strategies to enable students with learning disabilities to thrive both academically and socially. These successes, including our outstanding four-year graduation rate, have been well documented in the media and the college rankings. Over the years, we have realized that success for students who learn differently extends beyond innovative instructional methods. Success in our classrooms also depends upon scaffolded wraparound services such as family unit education, life transition management, personal and interpersonal skills coaching, career development and planning, physical and athletic training, and extending personal invitations to students to stretch beyond their imagined boundaries. But the abiding culture at Beacon is to never be self-satisfied with where we've come, but to embrace innovative approaches to further advance the success of students who learn differently. Today, we have the unique opportunity to learn from one another and from experts in the field as we collectively work to propel our students in the pursuit of abundant and meaningful lives. Thank you for being here today and for your commitment to this important mission.
And now, to introduce our keynote speaker, I'd like to introduce Chairman Emeritus Dick Williams.
It's a great pleasure today to welcome our speaker, a well-known and emissary for information on autism. This gentleman has made a big name for himself, and I think if you read in your brochure there, you'll find exactly the legacy that he's created and his understanding and development, as his dissemination of information on the autistic spectrum. We're gathered today to talk about learning disabilities, and that is basically, or learning differences, that is the intent of this symposium today. But the relationship between autism and learning disabilities or learning differences is not obvious to everyone. It is mostly, I'm sure, to many people here. The reality is that there is a direct connection of learning disabilities and autism. It is the autism genes, that including those for learning differences, have been embedded in the human genome for many, many years. So there is, it's been selected for, and the existence of autism is, in fact, a genetic production leading to a huge genetic and diversity that brings in neurodiversity that we have now only begun to understand. Steve Silverman's book has brought together our understanding in many ways of neurodiversity, and he's put it on the front table so that everyone has a chance now to understand the genetic differences that exist within the population. The reality is the old-fashioned school way of linear learning, sequential learning, is not the way it works for those with learning differences. You have to do it differently, and that's why Beacon has been such a success as it is. So in addition to those items that have been stated there in the brochure that you have in front of you, I'd like to note that Steve Silverman was a keynote speaker for the United Nations on the occasion of the Autism Awareness Day, an outstanding opportunity to spread the word around the world. In addition to that, he has spoken at many of the great universities, including MIT, Oxford, Harvard, Yale, on the topic, where he's actually referring to and speaking to the academic community in an instructional way in many ways to help change the concept of understanding neurodiversity. So with that, he has been remarkably successful in his TED Talk. I'd like to state that the TED Talk has had over 1 million views and has been translated into 25 different languages. So he's made quite a world impression, and it's with a great pleasure here that I would like to ask Steve to come up and tell us a story today about neurodiversity and autism.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's really wonderful. I've heard about your book, and I'm going to read it starting tomorrow. But this is my question.
Yeah.
My question is, can you speak to the differences of between the gender and how autism presents itself in the males and females?
Big time. That is such an important question. I'm so glad that you asked that. You know, it's been almost taken as a matter of faith, really, that many more boys are autistic than girls. I think that is not true. I think that what it is that we don't know how to recognize autism in girls. And that's because autistic boys often come to the attention of parents and authorities and disciplinarians for being aggressive and being defiant. Whereas girls, because of sexism basically, are programmed to fade into the background and to script their conversations to create, you know, the smoothest possible social atmosphere around them. And as a result, we do not pick up autistic girls. And I'll give you a very vivid example of that. There's a guy at one of the biggest research centers in America for autism, the Yale Child Study Center, and his name is Kevin Palfrey. He does nothing all day but screen kids for autism. He missed autism in his own daughter until she was 12. So that is how much the model of autism, and unfortunately both Asperger and Connor contributed to that male-centric model. Asperger did not write about any autistic girls, although he did, to his credit, which is hardly ever mentioned, he did write about autistic traits in the mothers of autistic kids. And he actually, instead of saying, you know, that made their kids autistic, he said he and his colleagues actually said that it gave the parents and the kids a common ground to be able to communicate in very special and intuitive ways, which was very prescient. Connor did write about autistic girls, but he wrote much more often about autistic boys. And, you know, that's only starting to change now. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that a lot of the people who have come forward as autistic self-advocates online a lot of the best writers are women. So Julia Bascom, I want to give a special shout out to her. She is the head of a group called the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. She created an anthology called Quiet Hands of autistic writing. A lot of the autistic writers these days are women, young women. And that is pushing to the fore the experience of autistic women. And I think that's really important. Another group, or multiple groups, that have been overlooked is autistic people of color. And that comes a lot out of Leo Connor's conception of autism as basically an upper middle class white thing. And there's an anthology called All the Weight of Our Dreams by Lydia Brown, which is the experiences of autistic people of color. I also wrote a book called, or not a book, an article in a science magazine called Undark. The title of the article is The Invisibility of Black Autism. It will tell you a little bit more about that history. But when people say to me, you know, it's become very trendy almost to say, well, isn't autism being overdiagnosed? Aren't these just, like trendy kids getting a diagnosis? Well, you know, all I can say is it's certainly not overdiagnosed among women and people of color. We have a lot of catching up to do. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, I'm
Thanks.
Pascal Fuchshuber. We are parents of a child that goes to Beacon, and I would like to thank you very much for coming
Thank
to
you.
speak to us today. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Neurodiversity. It sounds like it must be more than just autism. Can you
Oh, yeah.
can you go in a little bit into what you understand under neurodiversity and what else is in there, in your opinion?
Well, I don't think anybody argues that, it's a relatively new concept. In fact, so new that the British publishers of my book would not use it in the title. I said, no, use it. Everyone's going to be talking about it in a few years. No, I'm sorry, we've never heard of it. My book has the most cumbersome subtitle in England, The Legacy of Autism and How to Think Smarter About People Who Think Differently. Like, it's such a long title. But in any case, I would say that from my perspective, certainly what comes under neurodiversity would be, in addition to autism, would be ADHD, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, lots of conditions like that. Now, where you get controversial and tricky, and I still have not figured this out myself, is stuff like, well, is chronic depression part of neurodiversity, or is schizophrenia part of neurodiversity? I mean, schizophrenia is it's primarily a genetic condition. It's another condition where we've been studying it for years and still haven't figured out exactly what causes it. It's rough going. I have a young friend who became schizophrenic, and it's very, very difficult. Does it also convey gifts as well as challenges? I would say sometimes yes. My friend was one of the most creative people I'd ever known, but unfortunately, after he had a series of psychotic breaks, he had to choose between institutionalization and heavy meds, or living at home, which is what he does now. Those conversations are still unfolding. So certainly dyslexia, dysgraphia, autism, ADHD, controversially stuff like that is usually considered mental illness, like chronic depression and schizophrenia. Another provocative one is homosexuality. I was in the DSM when I was a kid. When I came out to my parents as gay, they were so concerned about my future that they sent me to a therapist for the cure. And after about 3 sessions, she was actually a nice lady. After about 3 sessions, I said, "Can I ask you a question? How much is this costing my parents?" And my parents were like poor school teachers. And she told me, and I said, "Oh my God, do you think I really need to be coming here?" She said, "You seem fine to me." And I said, "Can you tell my parents that?" So she did, And my father couldn't talk about it for years, actually. But he eventually came around, saw homophobia as kind of like racism or anti-Semitism, which I'd always been raised to, disavow. And eventually, they got to see me get married. So, but is homosexuality neurodiversity? I don't even know. I'm like a gay guy who wrote the book about neurodiversity. I don't even know. So these are all conversations that we're having now. Yeah.
My name is Dr. Linda Dew, and my father was a psychiatrist, so I would work in his office during the summers in college. So I saw a lot of people with autism or Asperger's, et cetera. And one of the things I found is when people have a passion, like you're talking about, the fellow writing the book about nature, they get together with other people who don't necessarily have on the spectrum, and then they develop friendships through shared passions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a huge thing. One of the most important things that I did for my book research was I went to a gathering of autistic people that was run by autistic people called Autreat. And I had never seen autistic people outside of a medical setting before that. I did this very early on in my research. And in fact, I remember walking around the Buffalo, New York Greyhound station or whatever, looking for this bus that was going to Autreat. And I was like, what am I looking for? Like, oh, okay, these people are autistic. Whenever I'd seen autistic people before that, I'd seen people who were clearly like really stressed out in an unfamiliar environment, being viewed behind a one-way mirror, like very artificial environments. So I'm looking around the Boston bus station, and suddenly I see a group of people who seem to be really having a good time and like laughing and hugging each other and slapping each other fine. Those turned out to be the people going to Autreat. And Autreat was like a mental shower that washed away any number of stereotypes that I had. For example, one of the people who was there was a guy named Ari Ne'eman, who had been appointed by President Obama to the National Council on Disability. But there were a couple of Congress people who were holding back his nomination or his seating on the council. But he finally got seated on the council right the night before he got to Autreat. So when he came to Autreat the following day, he was like the homecoming hero kind of thing. And so he walked into the room, and a young woman at the back of the room said, "We love you, Ari, if we were capable of feeling such an emotion." So I learned very quickly that, the notion that autistic people don't have a sense of humor, boy, that's wrong. And the other thing was that I saw people bonding over special interests. And I don't mean to be too stereotypical, but there was a lot of Star Trek going on, and Lego, and also history and stuff like that. And so I could really see how special interests could, and you don't even have to have like the exact same special interests, but just being able to understand what it's like to get so much joy out of being fully consumed by what you're into. Autistic people get that about each other, and it's a beautiful thing to see. Anybody else?
Yes.
Yes.
I am a special education attorney. I have read your book, and I recognize my own family in it.
Oh.
My son was diagnosed with, we called it Asperger's at the time,
Yeah.
when he was in 8th grade, and for many years with other different diagnoses. Are you working on another book in this area?
Not in this area. I'm
Okay.
working on a book about cystic fibrosis, actually.
Oh, okay.
Because a friend of mine, I did not know anything about cystic fibrosis, but I have a very good friend who I knew for years, and I was almost in awe of what appeared to be his radiant good health. He's like a handsome jock, and he just seemed to have it all going on and stuff. And I found out, well, actually, his life expectancy is about now, and he's in his he's in his early 30s. And I discovered that cystic fibrosis used to be an inevitably fatal childhood diagnosis. They would send you home with your baby and say, enjoy her for a couple of months because that's how long you'll have her. But now people with cystic fibrosis can live into middle age, have their own families if they're not infertile, and they want a future. And there have been all kinds of startling advances that nobody's heard of, really, because cystic fibrosis is considered relatively rare. And so I'm doing, in a way, it's a similar kind of set of problems, but there are also differences. For instance, people with, like, autistic community was so important to neurotribes. People with cystic fibrosis are not supposed to be in the same room with each other because they can cross-infect. And so I was very startled when I went to the National Conference on Cystic Fibrosis a couple years ago, and there was a big sign, if you have cystic fibrosis, do not enter this building. I was like, wow, this is like the big national conference on it. Wouldn't you want the people who are most affected? But they had to watch it streaming. So there are a lot of complex social issues around CF that's what I'm getting into. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, Dara McAnulty. Yeah, what's his name? Naturalist Dara on Twitter. And check him out. I mean, his book is going to be amazing. There's a fantastic, almost a dream of a literary festival that happens every year in a little town in Wales that has like 100 bookstores in one little town or whatever, called Hay on Wye. And I'm going to be having an on-stage conversation with Dara next April. If you want to go to Wales, it's a pretty country. And he's a doll. I met him last week actually in Ireland, and he's very shy. Like becoming a famous author is not on his agenda. What he wants to do is walk in the woods and write and be at peace with himself. And he's not, I mean, Greta Thunberg put herself in the public eye very much and has reaped a harvest of hate and horrible stuff. I hope that stuff doesn't happen to Dara, because Dara is a very, very sensitive person. But as a writer, he's one of the most talented young writers. And notice I'm not saying young autistic writers. He's one of the most talented young writers I've ever come across. He's like a genius. And so I'm very excited to have that conversation with him in Wales. And his book is called Diary of a Naturalist. Yeah. And I don't know, I hope it gets an American publisher. It's coming out from a small publisher in England called Little and Toller, I believe. But I hope it gets an American publisher too. McAnulty, McAnulty. And he's Naturalist Dara on Twitter. Yep. And he's going to be embarrassed that I'm talking about it so much. Anyway. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
It's okay. Don't worry.
And I hope you have a great day.
Steve, we have one more question.
Oh, sure.
Sorry, I didn't speak
No
up.
problem. No problem.
I'm a school counselor, and I'm the mother of a child who has Connor autism.
Yeah.
He flaps and speaks and
Yeah.
runs and is happy.
Yeah.
And he's 18 now, so I've seen the differences in what the movies and the TV shows have portrayed. People on the spectrum
Right.
are not him.
Right.
And so how does that, I have an opinion, I want to hear your opinion about how it affects people on the spectrum that aren't represented in these movies as being eccentric and a savant. Someone says, oh, what is his special skill? Like, I don't know, he can't tell me, I'm still trying to figure it out.
For sure.
So
Yeah.
how does...
That's a big problem of representation, because obviously Hollywood likes disability stories that are feel-good stories. So we can say, oh, we're being nice to these poor disabled people by liking them, And it's a lot easier to like a quirky savant, than somebody who hurts themselves or does not have an extraordinary talent or is not going to be the next guy at Google or whatever. And we need to be building support for those people as well, not just the next guy at Google. And one of the main misconceptions about neurodiversity, which is spread by liars, frankly, is that neurodiversity is only about people who are quirky and they barely should get a diagnosis. Well, for one thing, even the people I know who just seem to be like very high functioning, a phrase I don't like using, they struggle. Like there's a guy named John Elder Robison who wrote a bestseller called Look Me in the Eye several years ago. He would be what most people would claim to be high functioning. He built the fire-spitting guitars for the band Kiss, actually. Like his special interest was like doing guitar work and stuff. But I have seen him kind of behind the scenes, like really struggle with sensory overload and actually one time I saw him have what would really be called a meltdown. Temple Grandin, is an example of someone, oh, well, she's, some kind of genius and she doesn't really have problems. When she was young, she was getting kicked out of schools and churches. It took her mom and her years to figure out that she would have meltdowns in church because she was being made to wear a very itchy dress. There is, it used to be that the only representation of autism in media was like Rain Man. And if you notice, at the end of Rain Man, Dustin Hoffman has to go back into the institution because he could not survive the outside world. And one of the interesting things that I talk about in Neurotribes is that the real-life models that Rain Man was based on, none of those kids were in institutions. All of their parents had defied the best advice of their children and pediatrician to keep them at home and try to figure out ways of giving them support. But that was autism. That was the face of autism until this sort of geeky thing, And people say to me, well, isn't Bill Gates autistic? If Bill Gates is autistic, nobody needs help. Like that's like, oh yeah, so he can become a billionaire. There's too much, I would say, emphasis in the media on quirky, endearing characters, too little representation of autistic people who are really suffering, and not enough understanding of what the spectrum means, and also what the neurodiversity movement means. And the neurodiversity movement was very much a conscious outgrowth of the disability rights movement. Judy Singer coined that word after being mentored by a guy who had survived polio and lived in a wheelchair. And he taught her about what's known as the social model of disability, which says that instead of locating disability purely in the person, like you're broken, you need to be fixed, it locates disability in a mismatch between the needs of the person and society and what society provides for them. And the disability rights movement has never been about leaving the people in wheelchairs behind. In fact, Steve, who drove me here, told me this story about how the ADA got passed, and it was people in wheelchairs climbing up the steps of the Capitol. And so profoundly disabled people have always been foregrounded by the disability rights movement and are also foregrounded by the neurodiversity movement. The problem is that message has not spread to popular culture. And I'm sure it must be very upsetting to see just this kind of sunny representation of autism all the time when your son is struggling. Thank you. Take care.